for example, or ourselves, or our loved ones, or the people that we know. So, well, so I think this story is trying to hammer that idea home too, which is, don't be so sure that it's impossible, or maybe don't let the assumption that it's impossible stop you from going forth into the world. That would be, and that's a what would you say? That's like an inoculation against nihilism. And for a long time I understood nihilism very well. I could understand its rationale, associated with the tragedy of life, associating with suffering and evil, associated with the observation of finitude and the arbitrary and unjust nature of the world. But the more I've thought about it, the less I've come to believe that there's any excuse for it whatsoever. And I think the reason for that is that it forestalls effort. It forestalls the ability to discover for yourself. Maybe there's no reason to be so goddamn hopeless, except that it's easier to be useless. Now, and I'm not, believe me, I'm not making that case. I'm not saying that that's what's besetting people who are clinically depressed, for example. That's not my point. Clinical depression is a terrible thing. There's lots of reasons to be rendered, to be tossed into a catastrophic condition. That isn't what I mean. I mean that kind of cynical, arrogant, rational, hyper-intelligent nihilism that throws the world away as if it's of little use before it's been properly engaged with. Better to engage with it and see what happens, and better to make the assumption that if the world isn't returning to you what it is that you need, then either you're not doing it right or you've conceptualized what you need badly. Why not at least open yourself up to that possibility, right? Because you could be wrong. Hopefully, if you're suffering, this is a great thing to know. Hopefully, if you're suffering, you're wrong. Because if you're suffering and you're right, then there's nowhere to go. So it's very useful to find out whatever errors you might be committing. Another thing that's really interesting about the Jews in the Old Testament, it's a remarkable thing. Every single time they get flattened by God, it's always their fault. They never say, the world that God created was corrupt and God is evil. They never say that, no matter what happens, right? No matter what catastrophe occurs, when they have every reason to at least put that hypothesis forward, they don't. They say, we erred, we walked off the path, it's our fault. And that's hard, you know, because it puts all the weight of human catastrophe on the human being. That's very hard. But the upside is, it gives you the control. It opens up the door, it opens up the possibility that you could be the person that could set it right if you would just let go of what's in your way, whatever that is. And the men rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? I guess God is talking to himself here, or maybe he's talking to the angels. But I think he's trying to make a decision. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him. And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which has come to me. And if not, I will know. Well, we don't know what's happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, but we know that God's got wind of it and that that's not good. And we know that sin means to miss the mark. And so we know that whatever has happened in Sodom and Gomorrah means that something about the natural ethical order of things has been seriously violated. And there's a strong intimation in the Old Testament, which I think, by the way, is completely correct, that if the proper order of being is violated, and that's something like the balance between chaos and order, say, if the proper balance of being is violated, then all hell will break loose. And one of the things I can tell you from reading a very comprehensive set of myths from around the world, is that that's a conclusion that human beings have come to everywhere. Stay on the goddamn path and be careful. Because if you start to mess around and you deviate, especially if you know that you're deviating, things are not going to go well for you. And that idea is everywhere. And I think it's right. I think the idea is right, because there aren't that many ways of doing things right, and there's a lot of ways of doing things wrong. And if you do things wrong, the consequences of doing them wrong can be truly catastrophic. You know, one of the things I learned from reading Viktor Frankl first, but then Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who I think did a deeper job, was that, and Václav Havel thought the same thing, that these people were very much trying to understand what happened in places like Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago is a particularly good analysis of what happened in the Soviet Union. And his conclusion, and it's a 2,100 page conclusion, and it's like hammered home with a hammer. It's a book that everyone should read. You know, assuming that you can read a 2,100 page scream, because that's basically what it is. You know, first of all, what he does is document just how terrible things were in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959. And no matter how terrible you think they were, unless you know the stories, they were a lot more terrible than that. And they were terrible personally, because everyone lied. They were terrible in families, because 2 out of 5 people were government informers. They were terrible among friends, because no one could tell each other the truth. They were terrible socially, because the whole system was corrupt and ran on slave labor. And they were terrible philosophically, because the doctrine of man upon which the state was founded was hopeless and nihilistic. And they were murderous, destructive, and genocidal. It's like they got it wrong at every single level of analysis simultaneously. And the question is, why? And Solzhenitsyn's answer, and to some degree Viktor Frankl's answer as well, and Václav Havel, and I would say also Nelson Mandela and Gandhi, they all ended up in the same conceptual sphere. And the answer was because individual people lived crooked lives. Because individual people swallowed lies and spoke them and didn't stand up for the truth. And the corruption that spread from each individual pulled the entire state mechanism into that corruption and made everything into hell. You know, there are other theories. Obedience, right? That's kind of the Milgram idea from that it's easy to make human beings obedient to people in authority. And I've explored that idea quite a bit with regards to what happened, for example, in the Nazi concentration camps. And yes, you can set circumstances up so that people are likely to be obedient to orders that are pathological. There's no doubt about that. And yes, sometimes that's indicative of the weakness of their character, but that's not the issue. And the idea that what happened in Nazi Germany was because a population of good people listened to a tiny minority of bad people, that's really not a good theory. The Nazi ethos was there at every single level of the social organization, right? Right from the familial, all the way up to the leadership. It was the same thing all the way up and all the way down. And the same thing in the Soviet Union. And so, if you miss the mark, which is apparently what the people of Sodom and Gomorrah did, their sin was grievous, then they risked destruction. And I just cannot see how, after the 20th century, anybody with any sense could possibly not see that as true. And I think that there's a line in the Old Testament, you know, that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And I can tell you one of the things that frightened me badly was the realization from reading Solzhenitsyn and a variety of other things that I was reading at the same time, that Dostoevsky as well, because he makes the same point. He said that a human being is not only responsible for everything they do, but for everything that everyone else does. Now, you know, that's crazy, and he was an epileptic and a mystic, and that's a crazy thing to say. But it's also, there's something about it that's true, because if you were better, the people around you would be less worse than they are. And if you were good enough, you don't know how much better the people around you would be. And so, there's this idea too, you know, that Christ took the sins of the world unto himself. That's a complicated idea, man. I wrestled with that one for a very long time, but I think I figured out, at least in part, what it means. It meant that It's something like the realization of complete humanity. You see, to take the sins of the world onto yourself is to realize that, is to understand the Nazi concentration camp guard. Because that person is human, and so are you. And so if you can't see you in that, then you don't know who you are. And if you can see you in that, well, then you've started to take the sins of the world onto yourself, because you've actually started to take responsibility for those terrible things. You know, I think it's the motif of the motto of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. We must never forget. That's close. And I think, well, you can't forget. You can't remember what you don't understand. You will forget what you don't understand. And the question is, well, what are you supposed to remember about the Holocaust? It was a historical event, that 6 million people died. That's not what's to remember. What's to remember is that's what people can do. And you're one of them. And if you don't understand that you could do that, then you don't know who you are. So God's making a case here. He's making a case that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah have sinned, and it's making a large racket that even God has heard about. That's a very common mythological motif, by the way, that the sins and what would you call it? The sins and noise of humanity can reach such a clamor that even the gods hear and are forced to intervene. That comes all the way from the Mesopotamian creation story. So anyways, it's logical. Yeah, they're sinning. Okay, well, so what? Well, no, not so what. It means that God's offended and that everything is at risk. That's what it means. It's like that's something worth taking seriously. And the men turned their faces from thence and went towards Sodom. But Abraham stood yet before the Lord. And Abraham drew near and said, "Will thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked?" This is a very interesting part of the story. A friend of mine took me to task the other day when I was writing about portraying the Old Testament God as pretty harsh and judgmental, and the New Testament God is sort of all loving, which he isn't, because there's the whole book of Revelations thing. But I got that partly from reading Northrop Frye. But going through the Old Testament in more detail, I realized that is too low resolution interpretation, and that God, who's dispensing a fair bit of harsh justice in the Old Testament, is also someone who can be negotiated with, weirdly enough. And that's what happens here. You know, Abraham has just been told that whatever's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah is seriously not good, and that God's going to do something about it. And he takes it upon himself, this is an act of mercy, to ask God to be a bit more judicious, right? It's like, okay, you're going to wipe out the city. Well, bad things are happening there, but you know, there's probably a few people in the damn city that aren't completely corrupted by what's going on there. Of course, that's an open question. You know, because it's an open question, for example, how many people there were in Nazi Germany who weren't completely corrupted by what was going on in Nazi Germany. And the same thing could be said about Maoist China, and the same thing could be said about the Soviet Union. It's like, well, perhaps there was a person somewhere who didn't understand at some level what was happening, but, you know, the whole issue of willful blindness certainly springs to mind, if nothing else. Anyways, Abraham decides to intercede with God on behalf of these people who are going to be destroyed. He says, "Will thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Perhaps there be 50 righteous people within the city. Will you also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are there? That be far from thee to do after this manner." He's kind of reminding God that he's a good guy, as far as I can tell. "To slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That be far from thee. Should not the judge of the earth do right?" And the Lord said, "If I find in Sodom 50 right," he seems a bit taken aback here to me. "If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare the place for their sakes." And Abraham answered and said, "Behold, now I have taken upon me to speak upon the Lord, unto the Lord, but I am but dust and ashes. Possibly there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy all the city for lack of 5? And God said, "If I find there 45, I will not destroy it." And Abraham spoke unto him yet again and said, he's kind of sneaking up on God here. "Peradventure there shall be 40 found there." And he said, "I will not do it for 40's sake." And he said unto him, oh, let the Lord not be angry, and I will speak. Possibly there shall be 30 found there. And God said, I won't do it if I find 30 there. And Abraham, who seems really to be pushing his luck by this point, says, behold, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord. Possibly there shall be 20 found there. And God said, I won't destroy it for 20's sake. And he said, oh, let the Lord not be angry, and I will speak yet but this once. Perhaps 10 shall be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. And the Lord went his way, and as soon as he had left communing with Abraham, and Abraham returned unto his place. Well, there's two ways you can read that part of the story. One is that, three, let's say, you can bargain with God, even if you're kind of annoying about it, so that's kind of interesting. And the second is that even if there's a minority of good in a place that isn't good, it won't be slated for destruction. That's kind of a good thing. And the third is, a minority of good in a place can keep it from being destroyed. And that's a really good thing too, and I believe that as well. I think that good is more powerful than evil. Naivety isn't, but I think that good is. And I think that in a place that's corrupt, a minority of people who stand forth against the corruption can prevail. Now, you know, I think one of the best examples of that, again, was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, because he was in the terrible work camps when he wrote his book. He memorized most of it, which is not an easy thing to do when it's 2,100 pages long and set in very tiny font. And he memorized most of it, and then he wrote it. And it was one of the things that brought down the Soviet Union. You know, it was published in the 1970s, first of all in the West. And the first thing that happened, at least initially, was that the communism as an ethical system lost absolutely all credibility whatsoever among anyone who is even vaguely educated immediately upon the publication of the Gulag Archipelago. He pulled the moral slats out from underneath it. And the book was definitely one of the reasons, there were many, but was definitely one of the reasons why the rotten system crumbled and fell without a war. And that's a great example of how one person can take on a tyranny and prevail. So, and he's not the only person who did that sort of thing, because, well, Gandhi did the same thing. I mean, I don't think the English were the Russians, but, you know, things were not so good in India. And what Gandhi did in India, under the influence, by the way, of Leo Tolstoy, was also a remarkable example of a single person intervening in a catastrophe and setting it far more right than it could be. So, and there came two angels to Sodom at evening, and Lot, remember Lot is Abraham's nephew, sat in the gate of Sodom, and Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he said, behold, my lords, I turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and ye shall rise up early and go on your ways. So he's Abraham's nephew and kinsman, and acting in exactly the manner that Abraham does. He shows hospitality to these people. And they said, no, we'll stay in the street all night. And he insisted, he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him and entered into his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they did eat. But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot and said unto him, where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out to us, that we may know them. Well, that's the part of the story that's been used as a diatribe, let's say, against homosexuality, because to know is to engage in sexual intercourse, and the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah were willing to tear the strangers out of Lot's house and use and abuse them as they saw fit, right? And so what are they doing? Well, they're violating the principles that govern appropriate conduct with the stranger. And maybe the stranger is something you shouldn't mess with, because you don't know who you're messing with. So that's like warning number one. Well, and they're violating the essential principles of hospitality. And then there's the sexual thing here, I think, there's The sexual thing here is something more like the absolute danger of immediate gratification, sexual included, outside the constraints of any civilized structure whatsoever, right? Because that's as uncivilized behavior as you could possibly hope for, right? Strangers come into your city, they're in the house of someone who's part of your city, they're being shown hospitality, a mob shows up and says, fork them over, man. We're going to do whatever the hell we want to them, and it's not going to be good. And if you get in the way, things are going to go even worse for you. So that's what it seems to me to be. It's completely dysregulated behavior. It's behavior that's outside the confines of any civilized structure whatsoever. It's an indication that the social structure of the entire society has collapsed so that there's nothing left for the inhabitants to do except to engage in the most brutal of immediate gratification and destruction. Well, so what does Lot do? I pray thee, brethren, do not do so wickedly. Behold now, I have 2 daughters which have not yet known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and you do to them as is good in your eyes, only unto these men do nothing. And therefore came thee under the shadow of my roof. Well, it's hard to know what to make of that, you know. I mean, it doesn't exactly seem like the advisable thing for Lot to do. But I think at least what it is an indication of the degree to which he took the solemn vow of hospitality seriously. And I think that's the idea that the story is trying to promote. And the angel said, stand back. Oh, and the men said, stand back. And they said again, this one fellow came in to sojourn to talk to us, and he will needs be a judge. Now we'll deal worse with him than with them. And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. Maybe what Lot thought was something like, well, we're done. Like, we're all done with this mob. And perhaps I can spare some of us. And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. But the men, this is the angels, put forth their hand and pulled Lot into the house to them and shut the door. And they smote the men that were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves to find the door. So they were so corrupt that they were blind and could not see now, even to find the door. And the men then said unto Lot, hast thou here any family members, son-in-law, and thy sons and thy daughters, and whoever thou hast in this city, get them out of the place, for we will destroy this place, because the cry of them is waxen great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. And Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and said, up, you get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. And when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, arise, take thy wife and thy 2 daughters which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. And while he lingered, the man laid hold upon his hands, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto him. And they brought him forth and set him without the city. So, this is an indication of the danger of not acting with appropriate haste when the time has come. I mean, Lot's already seen what happened. He saw that the men came to his door. He saw that they were murderous rapists. He saw that the angels took them out. And he's still hesitant to leave that place. And so I guess one of the things that this story requires people to ask themselves is, are you in a place that's so bad that you should leave? Or when are you in a place that's so bad that you should leave? And if you are in a place that's so bad that you should leave, then the time to leave is now, because there's no time to waste. And it came to pass when they had brought them forth abroad that he said, escape for thy life, look not behind you, neither stay thou in all the plain, escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed. And Lot said to them, "Oh, not so, my Lord. Behold now, thy servant hath found grace in thy sight, and thou hast magnified thy mercy, which thou hast showed me into saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountain, lest some evil take me, and I die. Behold now, there's a city near to flee unto, and it's a little one," which means maybe it's not big and corrupt like Sodom and Gomorrah. "Oh, let me escape thither. Is it not a little one, and my soul shall live?" Matthew Henry said, "Lot lingered, he trifled. Thus many who are under convictions about their spiritual state and the necessity of a change defer that needful work." And he said unto him, "See, I have accepted thee," the angel. And he said unto him, "See, I have accepted thee concerning this thing also, that I will not overthrow this city for the which thou hast spoken, the small city. Haste thee, escape thither, for I cannot do anything till thou be gone hither." Therefore the name of the city was Zor. That's where Lot went. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zor. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew the cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. No nostalgia for catastrophe. I think that's what that means, is that when you leave what's not good, you wash the dust off your feet and you don't look back. And that's a very harsh lesson. This is echoed a bit in the New Testament. The idea of the necessity for immediate action. These are some of the harsher words that Christ said. This is from Matthew 8. Christ is addressing a multitude and asking people to follow him, and a disciple comes up to him and says, "Lord, suffer me first to go and bury my father." Seems like a perfectly reasonable request. But Jesus said unto him, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their dead." This is from Matthew 12. While he yet talked to the people, behold, his mother and his brethren stood without, desiring to speak with him. Then one said to him, "Behold, thy mother and thy brethren stand without, desiring to speak with thee." But Jesus answered the one who was telling him and said, "Who is my mother and who is my brothers? For whosoever shall do the will of my Father which is in heaven, the same is my brother and sister and mother." Well, what does all that mean? It means that there's no excuses whatsoever for not getting up and getting at it. That's what it means. And it means that it even means that when people are beset with a catastrophe, like let's say the death of their father, that they are prone to use that as an excuse for not going about the business that they should be going about. Because they can say to themselves, well, I would accept. And accept, there's always good reasons. I mean, believe me, there's always good reasons for not doing what you should. That's for sure. The reasons pile up day after day to not do what you should, especially because you're aiming at things in the future. You can put them off indefinitely, right? Because of the demands of the day. But these stories, they say a variety of things, you know, especially in combination. They say, when you leave somewhere terrible, do not look back. There's no nostalgia. That's the letting the dead parts of yourself go. And then if you're going to follow the good, there's no excuse not to do it, and it means no excuse whatsoever under any circumstances. And then it's taken even farther with regards to familial relationships. It is, you can't even let them stand in your way. And I think that's all true. And I think I've seen virtually all of that in my clinical practice. Like, there's no excuse whatsoever for not getting at what it is that you should be doing. And I think there's something else that's going on here, especially in the New Testament stories, which is even maybe worse, which is it's absolutely reprehensible to justify your inaction with a catastrophe that extracts mercy from other people, right? There's a tricky game that's going, well, of course I can't do that. Look at the terrible thing that's just happened to me. It's, yeah, okay, I understand. You're absolved of any necessity to move forward because of your current catastrophe. It's like, well, actually you're not. And it's rather rude of you to use it as an excuse. And it's certainly counterproductive. And Abraham got up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord. And he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward the land of the plain. And behold, and lo, the The smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in the which Lot dwelt. And Lot went out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountain, and his 2 daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zoar. And he dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said unto the younger, Our father is old, and there's not a man in the earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. And it came to pass on the morrow that the firstborn said unto the younger, Behold, I lay yesternight with my father. Let us make him drink wine this night also, and go thou in and lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. Well, it's like the story, the story's outlined the catastrophe of Sodom and Gomorrah, essentially the ethical catastrophe of Sodom and Gomorrah, the dissolution of the civilized constraints that should regulate all behavior. And then the city is destroyed, but there's an echo of it afterwards, right? Because Lot had lived in Sodom and Gomorrah. And what happens to him, even after he escapes, is that he gets tangled into an incestuous web. And so I think that it's not foreshadowing, it's post-shadowing, if there's such a thing. It's an echo it's an echo and a reminder of how terrible whatever it was that was happening in Sodom and Gomorrah was. That even after escaping, the iniquity still remained. Well, that's a pretty good place to stop. We got through 2 of 3 stories, so that's not too bad. Next week, I'll talk about the sacrifice of Isaac and see if I can get into the next stories as well. And next week is the last lecture, except I talked to the theater people, and it looks like I'll be able to rent the theater once a month, at least for the next 4 months. So I'm going to do that, and I'll announce when I'm going to do that, and I'll continue doing this probably as long as you'll continue to come and listen. I could tell you something cool that happened too, if you want. So, some of you may know that there was a memo leaked at Google. How many of you know about that? Oh, wow. A lot of you. So, a colleague of the man who released the memo got a hold of me yesterday and said that the man who wrote the memo wanted to talk to me. So I interviewed him today. I made a YouTube video out of it. We went over his memo, which was scientifically accurate in my estimation. And so I'm going to release that hopefully tonight. So we'll see how that goes. He got fired last night, right? He got fired for perpetuating gender stereotypes. He told me today that his last performance review, he had been given superb, which is the top few percentiles of the employee distribution at Google, right? Perpetuating gender stereotypes. I went through his document. I don't think he said a single thing that wasn't substantiated by a fairly dense scientific literature. Not to say that the scientific literature is necessarily 100% correct, because it never is, but certainly to say that he was not merely spouting out a misogynistic and ethnically biased opinion. Quite the contrary. So we had a nice discussion about that today, and hopefully the discussion will continue. So, all right, questions? Hello.
So how does it feel to be a grandfather?
Well, it's great. I mean, look, a couple of things about that. I mean, my daughter has had a catastrophic life in many ways. A lot of things went wrong with her physically, really bad things. And this went perfectly. So like, thank God for that. So then, and then the other thing is, I love kids, you know. Now infants, well, you know, infants are cool and interesting, but I'm not sure exactly what to do with them, you know. But once they're about 6 months old, and then from then on, like, I love having kids around, so I'm thrilled about the fact that this has happened. So hooray, you know, hooray. So thanks for that.
So more as an aside, but what you said about not pushing aside the things of the day kind of made me think of Nike's motto, just do it. So that was, I thought, cool. But my question was that when you were talking about circumcision being a contractual relationship between sacrifice and compared it to a girl having a period, that didn't make a lot of sense to me. But also, it seems to me that it being a sacrifice requires some form of willingness, basically, from the one having circumcision. And I don't necessarily want to put forward what you didn't. You said you specifically didn't want to address as to infants not having any choice in the matter, but more in the context of it being a sacrifice. How does that?
I think that's how a modern person would see it, and I think that there's some utility in that, but it's incomplete to some degree, you know, because one of the things that happens with God and Abraham is that God tells Abraham that he has to take care of his family, his children. Now the question is exactly, how do you take care of your children? And the answer is, sometimes you make decisions for them. Now, you might say, well, it'd be better if they could make the decisions for themselves, and that's actually the case. So you might say, well, I won't bring my kids to church because it'd be better if they could make the decision for themselves. And that's what I did with my kids, you know. But I'm not so sure that was a good idea. And the reason I'm not so sure it was a good idea was because there are a bunch of things they didn't learn. Now, the degree to which a parent should exercise control over his or her child is indeterminate. But I guess the hope is that you exercise the minimum amount of control necessary to maximize the child's probability of success. And that certainly requires adopting responsibility for making decisions as well, because the child can't make decisions. You know, you can't just let the child lay there and make decisions, right? That's just not going to happen. And so you might say, well, Abraham has no right to impose something like circumcision on his children. And because it's a sacrifice, it's something that they should be doing themselves. But the problem with that is that Abraham also has no right to abdicate his responsibility to his children in the name of some hypothetical mercifulness. And those two things have to be balanced. Well, according to the story, Abraham got the balance right because, of course, he's made this covenant with God. Now, exactly what that means in people's day-to-day lives, well, that's a harder issue. But I would say, I think in the modern world, people err on the side of, I don't know. I think they're more likely to err on the side of taking insufficient responsibility for their children, letting them be free in ways that aren't productive. That's how it looks to me, often because they're afraid of their children. So that's about the best I can do with that.
Dr. Peterson, I've recently started reading Maps of Meaning, and there was something in the introduction to that story that I found particularly, the introduction that you wrote before you went into all the, that I found particularly compelling, I guess. The part when you were talking about the split that developed in your psyche when you were, you know,
Yep.
I think you talked about it in one of the earlier lectures.
Yeah, I talked about it a little bit today.
Yeah, a little bit today as well.
Yeah.
You said something in that paragraph there that what you said was you have to earn the right to identify with an idea.
Yeah, certain ideas for sure.
With certain ideas for sure. So basically my question is, how should a young person such as myself, who doesn't have a whole lot of life experience, be able to read literature and psychology and interact with, you know, the wisdom of culture and then incorporate it into a structure that's still authentically their own?
Well, look, I think the way you asked that question means that you're actually doing a pretty good job of that. Well, Well, I mean that because that was a very carefully formulated question, and it was obvious that you were actually looking for an answer instead of trying to tell the audience a bunch of things that you knew, which often happens with questions, right? And it's very annoying for the audience to be subject to questions like that, right? Because it's a form of manipulation. It's like, well, I'll cap this off with a question, but actually it's a speech. So I would say you probably already know the answer to that. But then I could elaborate on that a little bit. It's like there are a lot of books that people have historically regarded as great. You might as well start by assuming that they're at least greater than you, right? And to approach them with that frame of mind. Because even if there's much in them that perhaps is no longer relevant, often less than people assume, there's much in them that will be of extreme benefit to you. And then with regards to making them yours, the kind of wisdom that you get from great books is practical wisdom. And you act it out. And so then what you do is you try to incorporate what you learn into your life, into your practices. And then if you incorporate it into your life and your practices, you build a bridge between you and the great idea. Right? Because you figured out how to manifest itself in the conditions of your own life. That's something like making the archetypal personal, which is the right thing to do, right? It's the proper thing to do, because that expands your life upward and outward and ennobles you and brings you up as well. But so humility is part of it. It's like approach these books as if they have something to teach you. And then it's humility again in the second place is don't take the ideas to yourself until you've lived them. There'll be lots of time for that. And besides, even as a young person, it's not like you have nothing to say. But the only things that you have to say are your things to say. And it's not necessarily that easy to figure out what they are. But as I said, you did a fine job of that when you asked the question. So I think as far as I can tell, you already know what to do. So good, do it. Read everything great you can get your damn hands on.
Hello, Dr. Peterson. So a lot of your work, a lot of your lectures recommend the audience tackle life with a lot of attention and intention. And, in my kind of personal gateway drug to philosophy has been more Eastern philosophy. And like the Bhagavad Gita and the work of Alan Watts and Taoism. And what I noticed, I may be wrong, but this is a common theme in Eastern philosophy, which is more passive, non-action, don't make as many plans. I wonder how you reconcile that and how you are reconciling that, because you mentioned earlier in previous lectures that you've read the Tao Te Ching. How do you reconcile those two different views?
Well, I think first that the Tao Te Ching in particular isn't about inaction, it's about minimal proper action. And it's also about minimal proper action after a tremendous amount of sacrifice. Right? So the sage that's speaking forth in the Tao Te Ching has already let go of almost everything that he needs to let go of. And a tremendous amount of what you're reading in the Eastern philosophies is predicated, I think, at least in part, on the idea of sacrifice. There's lots of things that you're grabbing onto, like the monkey, with the jar, that's actually causing your misery. And so sometimes letting go is the right way of moving ahead. But to me, that ties into this idea of sacrifice. So now whether there's more than that, whether there's more intentionality in Western philosophy and less intentionality in Eastern philosophy, I'm not exactly sure. One way of mediating between those two was formulated, at least in part, by Carl Jung. Now, he pointed out that the archetypal figure for the West died at 32. And so, to some degree, the outgoing, extroverted, let's say, nature of the West is a consequence of its youthfulness, in some sense, its useful ethos. And that the East I mean, Buddha died at a fairly ripe old age. And even in the Hindu practices, if I remember correctly, in many Hindu temples, there's a lot of erotic sculptures. An idea is something like, if you can't get past the damn erotic sculptures, it's not time to go into the temple. But it's more than that. It might also be that if you're young, it's not time to get past the erotic sculptures. So maybe there's a moving forward into life in youth and a letting go in the latter part of life. And that was Jung's way of mediating between those two traditions. I think they're tightly aligned with regards to the importance of sacrifice. It frequently is the case that it's your desire, Maya, let's say, your desire, that's causing your suffering, right? And so there's an emphasis in Buddhism, even more than in Taoism, I would say, on letting go of what's making you miserable. But you remember, the thing about Buddha is that he got enlightened under the Bo tree, right? He basically stepped into the city of God. He stepped into nirvana. And he could have stayed there. But he chose to come back because he decided that he had a responsibility to rectify suffering in the rest of the world, that it was not sufficient for him to be enlightened while everything else was left in a state of insufficiency and suffering. And so I wouldn't call that inaction, you know?
It's I've made the mistake myself. It's inaction versus non-action. I actually had to look up non-action.
Yes, that's good. The Tao Te Ching does a very good job of distinguishing between those two, because non-action is the minimal necessary action to keep the balance between order and chaos proper, right? The yin and the yang. And the Tao Te Ching is very, very emphatic about this. You detach and you watch. And when it's time to intervene, you intervene minimally, without a lot of arrogant self-propagandization, and you tap. And if you do that properly, you hardly have to do it at all. And it's as if you're doing nothing. And there's great wisdom in that book. I really like the Tao Te Ching. It's a remarkable document. And I've seen managers who were like that, who were really good at running their company, who did nothing. And what they did, but first of all, they set up people to replace them. Because their idea was, well, if I'm a really good manager, then this place could run without me. There's a real humility in that. And then they just kind of wandered around the place talking to people. And if there was a bit of a problem, then they just, turned a knob a tenth of a degree. And the place ran smoothly, and it was as if they were doing nothing. And what they were doing was detaching, so they weren't being buried by their current concerns. They were watching to see what was going on. And then they were minimally interacting. And that worked like a charm. So I think that I don't like the idea that all religious traditions are the same, because that just makes them into like a gray mass. But I don't see that there's any difference there that can't be bridged. I think as you look into the details, the bridges become more clear. Yeah.
Mr. Peterson, first things first, thanks for kicking my ass.
I'll get you to speak into the microphone, especially when you're saying self-deprecating things. Just let everybody hear you. Okay.
First things first, thank you for kicking my ass.
It's my pleasure. What's happened? What's happened to you as a consequence?
As a consequence
Yeah.
of you kicking my butt.
Yeah, well, or of you seeing it that way anyways?
Well, mainly, I've had whatever you say, right, is something I've thought but not have been able to articulate, right? So it's been very helpful in that regards, and kind of saves me a lot of time, no?
Yep, good.
My main question is actually something you said a couple lectures ago. It was something along the lines of family. Does the history of your family, kind of like the sins of your family, something like that.
Yeah.
You're facing it all the time.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that more?
Well, there's this idea in the Old Testament that your sins might be visited unto your family 7 generations down. Seems kind of harsh. But, you know, when you're confronting, maybe your father's tyrannical. Yeah, but, you know, maybe his father beat the hell out of him. And maybe his father's father was a vicious alcoholic. And you just bloody well don't know how far back that goes. And that means also you don't exactly know what you're dealing with. Right? To some degree you're dealing with your father, but only partly. What you're dealing with is the pathological paternal spirit, something like that. And it's better to think about that way because it becomes an existential issue at that point. You know, so you could say that, well, the father has 2 components, and I mean this psychologically speaking. There's the great father that's beneficial and protective, and that organizes society and teaches you how to speak and has produced all these wonderful things. And then there's the tyrannical, oppressive part of the father. Just like there's the terrible part of Mother Nature that's destructive, and the benevolent part of Mother Nature that's wonderful and productive. And you're stuck with that, right? You're stuck with having to mediate between those opposing forces, just like you're stuck with the adversarial part of yourself and the heroic part of yourself. And it's up to you to set those things right. Otherwise, they propagate into the future. And it isn't a straightforward thing to say how to set them right. There's quite a good movie about that. Magnolia, which I really love. It's by Paul Anderson, if I remember correctly. I hope that's right. It's a beautiful movie. And it's about this, part of it's about this kid whose father's really pushing him to be a superstar at a quiz show, right? He's a genius kid, eh? And the kid studies this guy named Charles Fort. You don't understand this movie if you don't know this, because you got to know about Charles Fort to understand Magnolia. Charles Fort was this weird old guy who got rich with an inheritance when he was like 20 and spent the rest of his life in libraries looking up impossible things and documenting them. Impossible things that couldn't happen from a scientific perspective, that were well attested to by multiple observers. And he produced this newspaper called the Fortean Times, which still runs. Anyways, in Magnolia begins with this guy who falls out of a building and then is shot by a woman who misses her husband with a rifle as he falls. And I think she's charged with murder. And the street names have something to do with the deaths and his fall, and all of that happened. And then in the movie, there's a rain of frogs. And there are rains of frogs from time to time. Sometimes they're frozen. Sometimes they're rains of fish. Sometimes they're frozen. It's like, what the hell? How does that happen? It happens quite frequently, as it turns out. There's a rain of frogs in the movie Magnolia. And this little kid, see, what happened to him is that he's on stage and he ends up peeing his pants because of the pressure, basically, and humiliates himself. And then there's this rain of frogs, which he kind of takes as a sign from God. And then he goes to his father, even he's like 8 years old, this kid, and he says, you have to stop doing this to me. And he's dead serious about it, very careful, not being, you know, what would you call it, insubordinate, nothing like that. He decides that that's coming to an end right now. And you have to make those decisions in your family, because otherwise things propagate down the generations, right? And every family is rife with pathologies of one form or another. And you can learn from that and refuse to push it forward. And that's part of, I think, what you do when you shoulder your existential burden, because everyone is the beneficiary and the victim of the tyrannical father, just like everyone is the beneficiary and the victim of Mother Nature and of themselves. And so you lock horns with that and straighten it out one way or another, and you don't move it forward to the next generation. So, and maybe you detach it a bit from your parents too, because God only knows what combination of catastrophes culminated in their particular forms of pathology. So, good enough?
So this week we've had the Google thing. There was the YouTube thing that happened last week. What's going on with censorship, and what should people do about it?
If you're in a workplace and pathological things are happening, this is easy. I can tell you how you know if pathological things are happening at your workplace or they're happening with you. One of the two, but you can straighten that out. If you're being required to do things that make you weak and ashamed, then stop. Don't do them. Like one of the things I learned from Solzhenitsyn and Frankl was that systems go terribly out of control when people don't stop them when they're going mildly out of control. You know, and you might say, I should just keep my goddamn head down and shut up. It's like, maybe you should. Like, that's not bad advice. You know, you don't want to make unnecessary enemies, and you don't need any more trouble than you need. But you got to ask yourself on a day-to-day basis, what makes you think you're not selling your soul? You know, and there's so much foolishness going on in the mid-level bureaucratic world now. That's where all the tyranny seems to be focused. And the reason that it multiplies is because sensible people say nothing when they should say something. And what's so strange about that is that there are way more sensible people than people who aren't sensible. They're just not as noisy. So what you'll turn out if, like, you know, so let's say something's bugging the hell out of you at work. Well, then you have to prepare to find another job. That's the first thing you have to do. I don't think that you should find another job, but you should prepare to find another job. And if possible, you should prepare to find a better job. Because if you can't tell someone to go to hell, then you can't negotiate with them. And if they've got you over a barrel, then you can't say anything. So you got to set yourself up so you've got some mobility. And actually, that's a really good principle in your life, period. You should set yourself up so that you have a lateral move at hand. And then you should find out, well, are there things at work that are disturbing my soul? You know, and you find that out. First of all, you ask yourself, okay, I'm disturbed at work. Okay, I'm probably weak and deceitful and useless and lazy. You might as well start with that. And then you talk to some people, like your wife, your friends, your coworkers, and find out, are you stupid, deceitful, and lazy? Or is there something not so good going on at work? And so if you can then eliminate your own personal pathology as a cause of your dissatisfaction, then maybe there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. And maybe you should say something about it before the whole goddamn thing collapses, because that can happen. It can happen in companies a lot faster than people ever think. You know, and you may find that, well, first of all, you may find if you say something, well, first of all, that's an adventure, that's for sure. That's a bloody adventure. And you have to do it carefully. And you have to be prepared for it. But it might be the best thing that ever happened to you. And the other thing is, if you're careful about it, you get your words right. Like, and this is strategic battle, right? It's not something you wander into carelessly. Then you may find that there's lots of people who feel exactly the same way you do, and that you've actually cottoned on to something. You're a canary in a coal mine, and not just some like psychopathic mouthpiece. So you got to ask yourself when you go and do what you do, like, is this making you stronger? Is this making you weaker? And if it's making you weaker, then you got to ask yourself, do you really want to be weaker? Because the weaker you get, the more you're tyrannized. And then worse than that, like the weaker you get, the more bitter you get. And the more you'll work towards terrible things, the more you'll snap at your wife, the more you'll kick your kids, you know. Like, it's no joke to be tyrannized at work. And so I would say you have an ethical responsibility as a citizen to forthrightly confront creeping tyranny no matter where it occurs. And part of what we're learning, I would say, from these stories, if we're learning anything at all, is that if you're aimed at the good, which is a question you really got to ask yourself, you know. If you're genuinely aimed at the good, then take heart, because you're a lot stronger than you think. So,
I have a follow-up question.
Okay.
So, I'm speaking to, there's lots of people who are in this situation. Like, you know, people at universities and corporations all over the place. You know, Google is not the only company that is
imposing probably not the worst.
Repressive freedom of speech denying workplace codes. And everybody feels alone. Right? They're all like, why should I stand up, be a martyr, get fired? This guy at Google got fired.
Yeah.
What's the point? Like, I'm asking rhetorically.
Good. No, it's a good question.
And how do you convince people that there's a point to standing up when it appears to be futile?
Well, the first thing I think is you convince them that it's not futile. It might be difficult, but it's not futile. If you get your words right and you have something to say, there'll be an impact of those words. It might not be the impact that you would choose. But the other thing you got to tell people is, pick your poison. You may be in a situation where you don't have a cakewalk to the Garden of Paradise. You got tyranny or famine. Those are your choices. But you get to pick which one you have. And I would say if you're being oppressed, and I mean in your soul, by what you're required to swallow at work, well, you think you're not paying a price for that? You got no self-respect, and rightly so. But worse than that, you're an agent of your own destruction. You're destroying your own ideal, and you're letting people who are weak and corrupt win. And if you stood up and stood up properly, but you have to put yourself in order to do this, at least to some degree, right? You can't do it casually. You have to do it from some position of preparedness and strength. Then what makes you think you couldn't scare them back into the corners? And that would be a good thing. And, you know, the alternative, personally, is bad because there's a psychological degeneration that goes along with it. I've seen this with many, many of the people that I've worked with who have been tyrannized in the workplace to the absolute detriment of their psychological and physical health, right? To the point of collapse, confronting these crazy, crazy things when they were sensible people. That's a terrible price to pay, man. Like, it's a bad price. And then, if the foolishness isn't dealt with at the local level, when it's still relatively trivial, then it will multiply until it's dealt with at the social level. And we're seeing signs of that already. Antifa is a good sign of that. You know, and problems that aren't solved multiply, and soon people fight. And you know, better to argue than to fight, unless you want to fight. And some people want to fight, and I can understand why, but I wouldn't recommend it, because that doesn't lead good places. It really doesn't lead good places. So I'd say you have a duty. Maybe that's why you stand up. It's because you have a goddamn duty to stand up and just say what you have to say. You don't even have to be trying to make a point exactly or trying to get something done. It's like, this is how it looks to me. That's what that guy at Google did. He wrote this memo and he said, I talked to him today. He said, well, he went to a diversity training seminar and he thought, no, I don't agree with that. And so then they asked for feedback. So we wrote this document a month ago. This was written a month ago. Got no real response to it. Well, it bounced around inside Google until a lot of people, you know, got interested in it, and then it escaped into the outside world. But all he was doing was he was told a bunch of things he didn't think were true. He wrote down a bunch of things he thought were probably true. He launched that out and said, well, I think these things are probably true. It's like, well, probably they're true. Well, so he paid a price for it, but maybe we'll see what sort of price he paid for it. Man, he's going to be a lot tougher in 2 years than he was 2 years ago. So you can watch the video, the story's there, but that's kind of the outline of it.
So sorry to monopolize this. I have one other question about this, and I think it's important. Aside from Google just being a workplace, right, it also controls, they own YouTube, right, which is imposed a new censorship scheme. And it controls a huge amount of the information that people get.
This is true.
And so what happens to society when companies such as Google, which control our information, start to censor not just themselves and maybe the information that's coming out to the rest of the world? How much is this already happening? Yeah. And how much?
How about if we refuse to find out? That would be good. You know, like I reviewed this guy's document. I did that yesterday. And everything he said was validated by the scientific literature. So what has happened is that someone has been fired publicly by a major corporation for stating well-grounded scientific truths. Right. They're exactly the sorts of things that I say in my classes, for example. And the reason that I say them is because I read the literature. It's not because I'm personally happy about the facts. I think IQ research particularly is so dismal that you can't possibly read it without being seriously disheartened. If I could reconstruct the world so that the IQ research wasn't true, well, it'd sure be tempting, you know? But that's not how science works. Science doesn't tell you what you want to hear. It just tells you the way it bloody well is. And he got pilloried for revealing a good fraction of current scientific knowledge about gender differences. Okay, that's not good. And as you said, that's a big company and it controls our communication. So how about we do what we can to ensure that these large communication companies don't get to impose a factually false ideological structure on the rest of the planet. Well, you can think about supporting this guy who blew the whistle. There's a fundraiser for him online. He could use some money. He wants to sue Google. Yeah. You know, maybe we could let them know that hiring a human resources director who's also concerned with equity is probably not a good idea for a capitalist company. Why in the world would you hire your own enemies? I don't understand that. So, well, we'll see how the dialogue continues. But back to the personal, like, you need to say what you think because that's where you come from, right? And if you don't say what you think, then you kill your unborn self. That's what you do. That's what Cain did when he killed Abel. And that's why his punishment was unbearable. You know, you have things in you that are struggling to come to the light. That's the truth you need to utter. And you need to utter that truth because without that truth, you cannot live in the world. Because the world's real and you need truth to live in the world. And if you stifle your truth, well, how can that be anything but something that brings about hell? How could it be any other way? So you think, well, why should you speak up? That's easy, because the consequences of not speaking up, although delayed, are far worse. That's the reason. That's the reason. If it can't be courage, it could at least be prudence. So, yeah. One more.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. First of all, kudos for mentioning Magnolia. It's one of my favorite movies.
It's a great movie, man.
So a few months ago, I had a dream, and when I told someone this dream, they suggested that I read the book of Revelations.
Oh yeah, that's a bad dream, that.
There's a lot of interesting stuff in that book. The thing that I found really interesting right off the bat was the state is represented in two instances as female, positively and negatively. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that in the context of, like, in Maps of Meaning, you often talk about the state just as male or as masculine.
Okay, first of all, I'm going to comment on your T-shirt. That's a lobster hierarchy with Horus at the top, isn't it?
It's even better. It's the eye of a lobster. It's the best one that we found.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. That one really cracked me up when I saw it. I really thought that was funny, man. Yeah. And when my graduate students used to meet, when I first talked about this lobster stuff, we'd meet for breakfast, and they were a very combative, snappy group of graduate students, and they were always trying to one-up each other with jokes, and whenever one really pulled a good joke on another, they'd stand up and, like... It was really funny. It was really funny. Okay, let's see. Can I answer that question? You know how if you look at a room, every color that you see is dependent on every other color in the room, right? Your eyes adjust to that. So for example, if you're in a room bathed with red light, your eyes will, in some sense, remove the red so you can still see the colors. Okay. So your perception is to some degree dependent on context. And that's one of the things that makes the symbolic interpretations tricky, because to see how something is represented symbolically, you actually have to look at the broader narrative context within which the symbols are embedded. So for example, let me see if I can get this right. If the story has an island and an ocean, then the ocean is often symbolically feminine and the island is symbolically masculine. But if the story is the island and the sky, then the island often becomes symbolically masculine and feminine and the sky is symbolically masculine. And you might think, well, how can the island be masculine and feminine at the same time? And the answer is, well, it depends on what it's being contrasted with and why. And so that's part of the key to the change in symbolism in the book of Revelation. And so it isn't inevitably the case that culture is represented with the patriarchal symbolism, but it's most commonly the case. So, there is Mother Russia, for example. I guess it would depend to some degree, too, on what your metaphor is for the state, because the state can be an all-providing mother, or it can be a judgmental father. And it seems that we tilt more towards the father with regards to terminology relating to the state. And I think the reason for that is because I think human hierarchies, like chimp hierarchies, are fundamentally masculine. The fundamental hierarchy is masculine. Even with chimps, there's a female hierarchy, but it's like the female hierarchy is nested within the male hierarchy. It's not the case with bonobos exactly, but I think it is the case with human beings. And so I think we have a strong proclivity to masculinize the state. But that doesn't mean there aren't exceptions. And symbolic representations are very slippery that way, because you can't stamp an entity with a symbol, because that would be the same as just giving it a name, right? And you can't have a dictionary of symbols where you say, well, a house always means the psyche. It's like, no, sometimes the house means the psyche, but it depends on the story. And so you have to take the entire structure of the narrative into account to determine why those particular symbolic representations are being used. What I offered in Maps of Meaning was kind of a shorthand. Generally speaking, there's nature, positive and negative, usually feminine. Generally speaking, there's culture, positive and negative, usually masculine. And generally speaking, there's the individual, good and evil, right? Heroic and adversarial, often typically represented as masculine, especially in adventure stories. But it's a schema and it's an interpretive guide and not a set of hard and fast rules, because you're in the domain of metaphor, and it's a slippery domain. So, do you have any luck figuring out your dream?
Sorry?
Did you have any luck figuring out your dream?
At least in some parts. I think there's different levels of analysis. I mean, one was pretty obvious.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
If you found this conversation meaningful, you might think about picking up Dad's books, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, or his newer bestseller, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. Both of these works delve much deeper into the topics covered in the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. See jordanbpeterson.com for audio, ebook, and text links, or pick up the books at your favorite bookseller. Remember to check out jordanbpeterson.com/personality for information on his new course, which is now 50% off. I really hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, please let a friend know and leave a review. Next week's episode is a continuation of the biblical series and is titled Abraham and Isaac. Talk to you next week.
Follow me on my YouTube channel, Jordan B. Peterson, on Twitter @Jordan B. Peterson, on Facebook @Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, and at Instagram @Jordan.B.Peterson. Details on this show, access to my blog, information about my tour dates and other events, and my list of recommended books can be found on my website, jordanbpeterson.com. My online writing programs, designed to help people straighten out their pasts, understand themselves in the present, and develop